Hello, it is December the 25th. It is Australia, so it is exceptionally hot, very hot. And the book I'm reviewing today is non-fiction, and it has one whole chapter dedicated, at least in part, to the Boxing Day tsunami. I hope that isn't a prescient of what we're going to be seeing this year. Anyway, so Grave Secrets by Meshel Laurie. Thank you, Beck, for donating this book for my reading pleasure. I was really excited to have a non-fiction true crime. I haven't read a new one recently, and this came, highly recommended it, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. So Meshel Laurie is apparently the host of an incredibly successful Australian true crime podcast, which I think someone, Grace, if you're watching, maybe you recommended to me. Since I've only ever tried podcasts once and they just didn't grab me very much, I had never heard of Meshel Laurie. However, whether you've heard of her or not, if you enjoy true crime of any description, you will probably enjoy this. If you're Australian or interested in Australia, you will doubly enjoy this, because this is very Australian. All the cases are part of the memory or recollection of Australians to some extent. Meshel Laurie, yes. She delivers a very engaging and very enjoyable book, exceptionally well researched by all accounts. She's spoken to a huge number of forensic pathologists, largely in Victoria, but a couple from elsewhere. There's homicide detectives, again, largely Victoria, defence barristers, victims' families, and she gives us beautifully multifaceted descriptions of various disasters and crimes. None of them are entirely new to me, and a few have come up recently for different reasons, but the perspective is entirely different. And Laurie's intention seems to be to bring forensics and pathology out of the back room to which they've been relegated by, I suppose, traditional mainstream media. A point she makes over and over again is that families who've experienced a loss, whether it's through a tragedy, a disaster like fires or floods, or through crime, they may be familiar with the detectives and various other people, but they will rarely, if ever, know what actually happened to their loved ones, and they won't know very much about the pathology and the forensics, which are certainly what are required if it's going to get to a court of law, but in the case of national disasters are often very, very necessary in identifying bodies. So one of the interesting things to me that was especially interesting and very, very much something that rang true is when she was describing how she became to be a podcaster, she was talking about how traditional, she calls it traditional, I tend to call it mainstream media, assumes that consumers have got this shrinking attention span. They basically think we've got the proverbial goldfish brain, though goldfish are actually much smarter than people think. But yeah, 60 seconds is the absolute maximum that most traditional media will ever give you a news story on. And it's pretty close to useless to do anything than convince the person watching that they actually know something about the subject. It's impossible to inform someone in 20 to 60 seconds on any subject whatsoever. But that is what traditional media do, which is partly why I threw my last television set in a dumpster at the end of 1997. I've never owned one since. I don't watch the news. If I want to know about something, I can read about it. It's actually extremely insulting position on the part of mainstream traditional media to condescend to us, to assume that none of us have got any capacity of understanding anything and the attention span that doesn't last more than 5 seconds. So yeah, I don't like being insulted. Hence, I don't watch TV. Now, that shrinking of information that that the media gives you have led to what Meshel Laurie calls long-form journalism. I hadn't heard that referred to before, but it also led to her and other people doing long-form journalism and podcasts which actually will inform people extensively on subjects that mainstream media won't give you more than 3 seconds for. And I found that really, really interesting because I've got a checkered past with non-fiction written by journalists. I really like it. Mary Roach, I'm looking at you. The book she wrote about dead people was an abortion of a non-fiction subject. I really disliked that book. I've forgotten the name of it now. And other journalists as well. They decide to write a whole book, but at the end they give it to you in segments of the 3 seconds at a time that they have been taught to believe our attention span is. And the result is a bad book. This, however, does not do this. It actually gives you background information. The author has a vivacious, upbeat, yet respectful voice, hard to achieve with some of these subjects, and it works remarkably well with the subject matter. So it's not an easy subject matter, as she herself says. If you've had anyone who's gone for an autopsy, you probably don't want to know exactly what happens there. This is something that rightfully is more and more hidden from the public, and she's sensitive about how she describes things. You're not going to be in trauma from anything in this book, but it does give you a much deeper insight into the people who do those behind the scenes things. Now, I could rave about this book extensively, but I'd like this to be a shortish review. I've got other things to do. It's meltingly hot. I'd like to go to the beach. Okay, so I mentioned chapter 2, the Flinders Street extension. Now, I'd heard a little bit about the Flinders Street extension through various sources. Apparently back in the day, a very long time ago in Melbourne, the Flinders Street extension was where all the autopsies and the forensics were done. It's an interesting chapter if you are into police, historical police work, or Victoria. Anyone who's interested in true crime, particularly historic true crime, should find that interesting. I've read other books that touch on similar notions of how historically autopsies didn't always work, apparently in America much more recently than you'd think, and how those things have been upgraded. Chapter 3 is about David Hooks. David Hooks was an interesting case because he was a very well-known Australian character. He was killed due to a one-hit punch, and since then one-hit punches have become a whole legislation of their own. It's like a one-hit punch is accepted in most Australian courts as potentially lethal, but back in the day, 1977, I think it was, in the 70s anyway, in Melbourne, when he came out of a pub in St Kilda, was punched by a bouncer and died, that wasn't the case. So chapter 3 talks to the investigative detectives who are on site, and it's an interesting viewpoint. It really showcases the different talents that went into that investigation, and it's a good viewpoint on how you can have 35 or more witnesses to an incident and still have confusion about what occurred. And from that chapter, I've found 2 more books which are specifically about memories, how they work, that I'm very, very keen to read. One of them is called Memory: A Contribution to Experimental Psychology, and another one's called Non-Believed Memories, which was in the Psychology of Science in 2010. I actually think that sounds really good. I'm hoping to be able to catch up with them. Okay, chapter 4, Floods and Flames. Specifically the Boxing Day tsunami, which devastated big parts of Asia, specifically Thailand. And I remember that one heavily because I actually knew someone who was in Thailand at the time. He's a great traveller. He spends a lot of time in Thailand. He was going to Christmas in Thailand in one of the worst hit areas of the floods, where basically hundreds and hundreds of people died. many of which were never well identified. And me and other people who knew him were slightly frantic. It turned out at the last moment he decided to leave the beach because it was too hot, and he was up in Chiang Mai or somewhere, and he surfaced alive and well. But for a while there, I was one of the people who thought I may have lost someone I was familiar with. Good points are made about that. One of the reasons why those floods the tsunami was so devastating was because the level of communication wasn't what it is today. 2004, was it? I think it was 2004. How time flies. Basically, today, if that happened, the information would be everywhere in the world within seconds of the first tsunami wave. But the first tsunami wave hit Banda Aceh, I can't pronounce that, Aceh, Indonesia, anyway. And about 20 minutes later, I think it was, that it hit Thailand, or it hit a second destination, and no one knew it was coming. These days, that would not be the case. As well, a whole heap of disaster scenarios were put in place in Thailand after that. I've travelled in Thailand since. There's a whole heap of tsunami information and escape routes and things. But then, even after it hit Thailand, it went on to hit India, where, again, hundreds, I think maybe even hundreds of thousands of people died there. And they still didn't know it was coming. So it highlights communication as well as the geology of it. But the majority of this chapter is interesting because it talks to people who travel to Thailand. And I've heard a couple of lectures, luckily. I've been lucky enough to hear a couple of lectures by people who went there to help with the genetic identification and tagging. But for anyone who hasn't been lucky enough to see such lectures, this is an excellent chapter. In the same chapter, we talk about fires, a big thing in Australia. We've got floods and flames. That's Australia, isn't it? We're either flooding or we've got fires. The fires were... It also mentioned the MH17 because it's talking about experts who go overseas for large-scale identification. The MH17 was another big one for identifications. Okay, so when you've got the fire identification of victims, what should I say? I am on YouTube after all. YouTube's got opinions. If you're interested, read this book. I do recommend it. I think it's a great book, and I think you should. And most libraries, I think, will have it, so you can go to libraries if you don't choose to buy this book. And there's a podcast as well. If you are a podcast person, go listen to this podcast. I'm sure it's out there. I'm sure it'll be great. One of the most harrowing stories from the fires, Ash Wednesday, Black Friday, was it the other way around? Is the family of mother, father and child who ran out the back of their house towards the fire safety bunker that was about 10 meters away, and they didn't make it. Between when they saw the fire, they fled out the back door. The flames were travelling that fast that they engulfed them, which is utterly terrifying, but fires in Australia are indeed utterly terrifying. Okay, so there's different chapters, and the chapters are well organised. Natalie Russell's Struggle is chapter 9. That's another interesting one because there was a serial killer on the loose in Frankston, and recently legislation has changed that people who are considered to be long-term dangerous can be kept in prison for the term of their natural life. And while anyone who lost Natalie is devastated, I have recently seen a couple of interviews with people as this legislation was coming in to keep her murderer behind bars forever, and a couple of them say, which I think is incredibly big-hearted of them, that at least she has died for something that will probably stop many other women from dying in a similar circumstance, because there are people who are just serial offenders. They will keep going. The person who killed her seemed to have no human feeling for others whatsoever. And if I ever go to Frankston, I'm going to stop by Nat's track. I'll leave a flower there. So each chapter is good, except I've got to say, the one I was looking forward to the most is chapter 10, the last one, and it's titled CSI Told You Lies. And I was going, yes, CSI did. I don't watch TV, but sometimes in other locations, I get to see them. I get to see bits of the episode. I have always sneered extensively at the CSI shows that I have seen. I am lucky enough to have spent a certain amount of time in laboratories. I like laboratories. One of the laboratories that I've actually visited is mentioned in a less than complimentary way, but a very sensitive way. In one of the, I think it might even be chapter 10, Brisbane Forensic Lab had a bit of controversy happening in 2022. Come on then. Come on. It had issues with identification, and she's doing her thing. It had issues with identification, it was falling behind, and some of the practices were poor. I had visited that lab, and at one stage I'd even considered applying for a job there. I thought again, I didn't do that. But having spent a certain amount of time in laboratories, I will agree with the points that are made here. They are notoriously underfunded, and they are underappreciated. The amount of work and the amount of protocols that need to go into that sort of thing. Having had their funding cut year after year, it finally came home. Oh, hello, we've made it, have we? Come on, little girl. Say hello for the camera. Aren't you beautiful? Yes, you are. Yes, but CSI Told You Lies. It certainly did. That, the first time I saw it, I just looked at it and I think I yelled at, actually, that's no laboratory. I think it's actually filmed in some amazing museum. It's got this emporium-like gorgeous decor, and everyone is coiffed and really well made up, and it's like, that's not a laboratory. That's the most BS thing I've ever seen. I actually got angry when the first time I saw a CSI episode. So yes, CSI did lie to you. People can't be identified from a tiny fragment in 24 hours. It doesn't happen. People who work in the forensic laboratories aren't sitting around staring into computers and being able to model the last 1,500 hours of a person's lifetime before they were knifed to death. It is complete and utter bollocks. And it is negatively affecting crimes, real crimes, and how they are reported. And it is negatively affecting how they are presented in court, because juries believe this utter hogswash that has been fed them through the television. Is that a bit strong? Well, you know, my opinion. Allegedly. So yes, the only problem with the last chapter, which I was really looking forward to, is it feels like a mishmash. It feels like a few last minute things were crammed in there, so it isn't as good a summary for the whole book as I would have preferred, but in general that's a fairly minor complaint against what is a beautifully written, immensely impressively researched, and very good to read book in general. I hesitate to call it fun, but if you like true crime, it is fun. It's very interesting anyway. You should read it, and you should comment and subscribe and stuff if you've heard the podcast, especially because I haven't. Is this the hill that my podcast version dies on? Maybe. I think I'd like to hear what Meshel Laurie has to say in podcasts. Okay, have a Merry Christmas if you do that. Have a great holiday if you don't. And if, like myself, you're working, enjoy the hell out of those penalty rates.